Hi everyone, welcome back. It's Professor Hall. Today we are looking at early science fiction. Some people think of this as a proto-science fiction work, and some people think of it as the first true science fiction book, at least the first science fiction book written in English, that kind of helped to establish science fiction as a genre. I will say, too, that I'm working from home today, and my dog is here in my office with me. So, if she barks, I'll pause the recording, and then I'll apologize. Hopefully, she'll stay quiet. So, let's get started. Mary Shelley, our author, was born in 1797. She was the daughter of philosopher and political writer William Godwin, and the famed feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the author of The Vindication of the Rights of Women. Shelley met the young poet Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1812 at the age of 15 and eloped. Now, back then, eloping doesn't mean that they're running off to get married, but they did run away together to France in 1814. So she met him when she was 13. They ran away together when she was 15. He was still married at the time, and his wife tragically committed suicide 2 years rather later, and at that point the couple did marry. So quite outside the norm. Her husband did not live that much longer. He died in 1822, and after his death, she returned to England, devoting herself to writing. She publicized his writings, and she educated their only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. Her best known work is probably Frankenstein, otherwise known as The Modern Prometheus. It was written in 1818 and revised in 1831. The text that I provided for you is the 1818 edition. I think that there are some odd changes and almost like censorship for the 1831 version. Sorry about that background noise. So, there was some censorship for the 1831 version that and some changes that you can read either one and pretty much get the same story, but I've given you the 1818 version at any rate. The text is partially a Gothic novel and partially philosophy, and so one of the reasons that we're not reading the whole thing, I find when I give people the full book that they find the philosophical parts quite dull. They drag on for a long time. So I've given you some of the action pieces that have a tiny bit of philosophy and some of these really interesting questions that are some of the primary questions driving science fiction. Can we do this scientifically and in terms of technological advancements? But if we can, should we? And what would that mean for people? And what would that mean for the things we create? Even though she's really known for Frankenstein, she did write other novels later in her life. Valperga, The Fortunes of Perkin Warbeck, Lodore, The Last Man, which is an account of the future destruction of the human race by a plague. That is actually sometimes known as her best work, even though that's not the work that she's known for, which I find kind of interesting. So, we have, I don't have here, as I've had before, the idea of the hero's journey. Certainly, I think you could, if you read the entire book, you could follow the hero's journey. What's the call to adventure? What is the abyss that Victor Frankenstein falls into? How does he have a kind of death and rebirth? What happens at the end? Is there an atonement? All of those things. Sorry. But because we're just looking at excerpts, I just kind of want to summarize those excerpts. So, before the monster, I have the monster in quotes. The monster is never named, but at any rate, as with much of early science fiction, the reader is not put into the strange or speculative story from the beginning. We really do have, in many of these works, a narrative exposition many times that lasts for quite a long period of time. And the reason for that, I think, is that a lot of authors didn't think that their readers would be willing to suspend disbelief if they just dropped them into this fantastical world. So if you think about something like The Wizard of Oz, we see Dorothy on the farm with her family, and then she's taken up into a tornado, and that transports her to this magical world, right? And in a lot of science fiction works, early science fiction, we have something similar. So instead of just jumping right in to the story of Victor Frankenstein, we start with a series of letters from the captain of a ship that's bound for the North Pole. He tells his sister the story of how he came upon a stranger who'd been traveling by dog sled and is weakened by the cold. This is a picture in the 1800s of a ship trying to reach the North Pole. There were a lot of people around this time trying to make expeditions up to the North Pole. And I think it's interesting, too, that we had this in the Blazing World as well. The idea that the North Pole is kind of this like magical destination where your compass won't work and it'll transport you somewhere else. The stranger is Victor Frankenstein, and eventually we hear his story. So I have cut this out for you. We don't see this portion of the book because there's a lot of long letters from the ship's captain about how he's lonely and things like that. But the technique of layered narration is used throughout the book. So then in our excerpt, we pick up with Victor telling his story. We also have some letters from people in his life as they tell portions of their story. And then we'll pick up a couple chapters after that and see the monster telling his own story. I think it's very interesting narrative technique that we have these multiple narrators to fully give us a picture of what's going on. And again, this idea of how scientific advancement affects people. How does it affect Victor himself? How does it affect his family? How does it affect his creation? And how does it affect other people in the world who are encountering him? So, in our excerpt, Victor lived in Geneva. This is a picture of Geneva in Switzerland, with his parents, siblings, his cousin Elizabeth, his friend Henry, and Justine, a gentle girl the Frankensteins have adopted, who cares for William, who is Victor's youngest brother. That's going to be important later. So we have kind of the main characters here. It's really important to note Elizabeth is Victor's cousin, and the two plan to marry. In other editions, that relationship changes, and she's like adopted or an adopted sister, but yet they're kind of encouraged to marry. This really would not have been unusual at the time. A lot of people, when I teach this book, people are like, oh, that's gross, and that's part of this grotesque gothic nature. No. They're living in a small rural area. There are not a lot of options. Marrying your cousin at that point would not have been unusual, and it is not particularly important for a Christian society, although Mary Shelley appears not to really be a Christian, but she's living in a Christian society. It's not forbidden by the Christian Bible. So now, when we have more people in the world and we understand more about genetics and how genetic diseases are passed down, marrying your cousin is something you're not going to do. But it would not have been unusual in the 1800s. So, the book is part Gothic horror, part science fiction, and part philosophical debate, as I said. And I've given you some excerpts that contain a bit of plot, a bit of philosophy. And our excerpt begins after this description of Victor's early life. So we have Elizabeth, his cousin and love interest, Henry, his friend, Justine, who is kind of like a nanny, and then William, his younger brother, and then his parents as well. So, Frankenstein is telling his story in chapters 4 through 8. After the death of his mother, he decides to go to the University of Ingolstadt, where he studies natural philosophy. So, essentially biology and anatomy, as well as chemistry. This is from a movie, and I love this shot. Anytime something's on an angle like this, you're supposed to kind of pick up the tension, the psychological tension that he's not just straight up and down, but he's on this like weird side. But this is Victor way older than he is in the book, but becoming obsessed with chemistry and anatomy and biology. So yeah, he becomes obsessed with his pursuit of scientific knowledge, particularly human creation and death. And there's this really ironic undertaking where as he tries to find the secret of life, he kind of decays a little bit. He becomes very sickly, and he's not in a good state. So the question of whether a body could be reanimated really consumes him. And Victor makes a breakthrough, and even though it's kind of brilliant, he's horrified at his success and goes into a brain fever. I love the fact that these movies like totally take this out of context. In the book, he really is in a university setting, but the gothic horror here with, you know, the creature who the person who's kind of has a disability helping him, and all of these big chains and huge things. I love it. If you've watched the movie, I'm really trying to separate the plot points of the book from the plot points of all of these movies. But if you like this book, I don't have it in the read-alikes, but the movies are great. And also Young Frankenstein, which is a satirical and parody of Frankenstein, is also amazing, hilarious movie. So he goes into a brain fever. That's a pretty typical romantic plot device for the romances of this time. Not love romances, but the romantic literary tradition. People would go into brain fevers to kind of get them out of the way for a bit, and plot elements can happen without the main character. But it's almost that the idea that you are so overwrought with emotion that you have almost a nervous breakdown, and this affects your body, and that you go into like a coma, kind of. When he recovers, we see some letters from home. So again, this layered narration, including one from his father about tragic events back in Geneva. I don't want to give too much away, but essentially as a result of this information, Victor leaves school. He finds out what has happened to both his youngest brother and Justine, who is their friend and his brother's nanny. And we see the results of his creation and how they have affected his family. Again, I'm trying to give you a summary without giving too much away because I don't want to do too many spoilers. So that's chapters 4 through 8. The descent into madness as he becomes kind of a mad scientist, this creation of this so-called monster, the success that he has, the fall from grace that he has as this monster, does some things that affect his family back home. So then we skip ahead to Frankenstein, the monster, telling his own stories in chapters 11 and 12, and then also in 15 and 16. Frankenstein tracks down his creation. The monster invites Victor into his hut, and they sit by the fire as the monster tells his story. So you can kind of see that here, this confrontation between these two men. The monster talks about coming to after being created. He wanders around. He's very confused. He comes to a cottage where he observes a family. And he becomes more and more aware of his isolation, but also their poverty. So again, we have this interesting social commentary in the midst of this gothic horror science fiction story. He watches them and kind of learns how to speak, eventually learning how to read by watching how they read. He wanders the woods and he comes upon another cottage and he finds some books there. One of the books is Paradise Lost. That's a fictional retelling of Genesis, in which we see this battle between heaven and between heaven and hell. We see the fall of Lucifer, but also God creates Adam. And here I have a little bit of Adam and Eve and the devil, who is part angel and part serpent here, giving Eve the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which causes the downfall, because they knew good at that point, but they did not know evil. So after reading this, the monster considers the mortality of his situation. He was not created by God. He was created by man. And so he kind of looks to Victor as being a very imperfect God. And he looks at himself as being like an Adam. And he becomes more and more angry about this. And we really have this question of what Victor's relationship with his creation should be. What is his responsibility toward this creation? That in chapter 16, the monster, who is never named, becomes consumed with revenge and commits this horrific act, which we saw the effects of back in chapters 7 and 8. He tries to explain his reasons for what he has done. And again, he didn't have, his mind is a little bit more fully formed by this point. And he pleads with Victor to create a companion or a mate. He's alone in the world. He really feels this sense of isolation. He has tried to connect with people and has failed because he's a monster. He's not one of them. He's not a person. So he's not a human, but he's sentient, and he understands his place. And so that's basically where our excerpt ends. So after the excerpt, Victor at first refuses to create a female monster. Then he agrees. He sees the monster looking at him just as he's creating this woman. He changes his mind and he destroys this second creature. Now, in movies, he creates this and we get the Bride of Frankenstein. The monster takes revenge. And this leads to a chase between Victor and the monster through the north, which is where the sea captain picks up with Victor. The demise of both Frankenstein and his creation come to an apex at this point, and then we have the ship's captain kind of finishing out the story. So if you're interested in reading the entire book, you certainly can, but for the purposes of our class, we're just going to be looking at these few excerpts so you can kind of get a view of the philosophy and the science and the ideas that the author is putting forth. And I will, in the next lecture, talk about those ideas in a little bit more depth and look at some of the central questions that we're going to be asking throughout our course. So, if you liked this book, The Last Man by Mary Shelley that I mentioned before, you might like that. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. We're not reading that because it's so similar to this. Dr. Moreau is creating these creatures that are part man and part beast, and he's doing vivisections, which is like a dissection, but while something is alive. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A shorter book, but an interesting look at how science affects the scientist, and another early science fiction book. The Robot series, The I, Robot, by Isaac Asimov, I think is quite similar to Frankenstein. This question of if we create something and it becomes sentient, what is our responsibility toward it, and how will it can we program them to protect and preserve humanity, or will they turn against us? Jurassic Park might seem like a stretch, but the book, not the movie. We can we, and should we? A lot of intricate science in that book, a lot more than you would expect. There are some adaptations of Frankenstein. Dean Koontz has one. I'm not a super big fan of his work, but it is a page turner for sure. And then Pygmalion is not a science fiction work, but it really does have the same theme, written by George Bernard Shaw. Here we have a girl who is poor, taken in by a wealthy man, and he helps her learn how to speak in a different way, how to act as if she has money, and she really transforms, but then feels that she is not really fitting in with either place. The poor that she came out of, the situation she came out of, or the wealthy people she finds herself among. If you've ever seen... if you've ever seen My Fair Lady, it's based on that play. So, yeah, some great stories that I wish I could have shared all of these with you guys this term, but some of these same questions are brought up, and we'll talk more about those questions next time. I hope you enjoy the excerpts. Thanks, everybody.